Welcome to this edition of WION and VOA Co-Production. I'm your host, Susan Tehrani. I'm coming to you live from New York City. Let's go straight into our first story for you, where UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer is in Washington and is all set to meet US President Joe Biden. The duo would decide on whether to allow Kyiv to fire long-range weapons on Russian territory. This comes as foreign secretaries of both nations visited Kyiv this week. VOA's Eastern Europe Bureau Chief Miroslava Gungadze reports.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and British Foreign Secretary David Lammy made a joint visit to Kyiv, Ukraine, Wednesday. At the news conference with newly appointed Ukrainian Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha, Blinken affirmed the United States and Britain's backing of Kyiv's defense.
Here today, the United States, the United Kingdom are united in support of Ukraine and its success. Putin will not outlast the coalition of countries committed to Ukraine's success, and he is certainly not going to outlast the Ukrainian people.
The Ukrainians thanked the U.S. and Britain for pledged additional support of nearly $1.5 billion in aid, much of it to go toward the energy grid. However, Ukraine repeated its request that restrictions be lifted on striking targets deep in Russia using Western weapons, like the U.S.'s ATACMS and Britain's Storm Shadow missiles. Their use is currently limited to Russian targets within occupied Ukrainian territory. On the day of the visit, 17 former American and British diplomats and military leaders published an open letter urging Blinken and Lammy to change the weapons policy. U.S. lawmakers from both parties have made similar appeals to the Biden administration this week. Ukrainian lawmaker Volodymyr Vyatrovich pointed out that lifting the restrictions was essential for Ukraine's defense.
I believe at this stage of the war, one of the key issues which should have indicated a change in the United States' approach to this war is the possibility of using, including American weapons, against targets deep within the Russian Federation.
This week, U.S. President Joe Biden said his administration was working on the possibility of lifting these sanctions. Adrian Kartnitsky, a non-resident senior fellow at the U.S.-based think tank Atlantic Council, argues that changes in Western policy are necessary for Ukraine to either secure victory or force Russia into a peace agreement acceptable to the Ukrainian people.
The only way it'll work is if Ukraine has the capacity to disrupt Russia's economy by hitting its power infrastructure, and long-range missiles are needed for them.
Russian Duma Speaker Vyacheslav Volodin said Wednesday that if the U.S. and its partners allowed the use of long-range weapons, Moscow would consider the United States and its allies as direct parties to the war. Ukrainian MP Vyatrovich argues U.S. leaders to stop fearing escalation and to look at the big picture.
Only after the military defeat of the Russian Federation in this most aggressive war will there be a chance for us to return to a world where international legal acts are respected, where adherence to international legal norms is possible.
Blinken was due to stop in Warsaw on Thursday to meet with his Polish counterpart and reaffirm the U.S. commitment to collective defense and NATO. Miroslava Gungadze, VOA News, Warsaw.
Joining us now with additional reporting is VOA correspondent Jessica Stone. She's joining us live from the White House. Hi, Jessica. So U.S. President Joe Biden is expected to discuss the use of long-range missiles with UK Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer at the White House today. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, the two leaders will be meeting later today here at the White House. It's going to be the first official visit by the new British Prime Minister to the White House since he came into office. And, you know, the White House position, as does the Downing House position, seems to be changing on the giving of these long-range missiles to Ukraine, primarily because even though the initial fear was that Washington or London would be responsible for escalating the war. Now both these countries are making the argument that Russia has already begun taking its own long-range ballistic missiles from Iran, and that in and of itself is an escalation of this war. Ukraine's foreign minister made that same argument actually during the meetings with Blinken earlier this week, asking Washington to, quote, act boldly. And the Ukraine's Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, told the BBC that these Iranian missiles really do change the debate because they would allow Moscow to penetrate much deeper into Ukraine. And so the thinking is that Ukraine should have the same ability into Russia. Now, the U.S., the U.K., and France, they all make this type of long-range missile. It's unclear who, if any of them, would provide these weapons to Ukraine. Meantime, Putin has said that Russia will essentially be at war with the West if these weapons are given to Kyiv, because they need to have additional support from Western countries in order to operate. Susan?
And Blinken's visit comes on the heels of the U.S. presidential debate in which support for Ukraine, of course, was a key issue, and a question about it was posed to both candidates. Did voters get a sense of how these candidates would end the war in Ukraine?
Not a lot of detail from either one of them, really, Susan. What we heard from former President Donald Trump during the debate is that he wants an end to this war, but he would not answer a question as to whether he wants Ukraine to win the war. He just simply said that he wants the war to stop, and he maintains that he could negotiate very quickly through that effort and get an end to this war, in which he says he will save lives. For her part, Vice President Kamala Harris saying that she does support continuing support for Ukraine, but laid out and has a peace plan, but didn't really lay out any specifics. She did appeal, though, to the 800,000 Polish Americans in the battleground state of Pennsylvania, saying that if Putin gets into Ukraine, he would not stop. He would go for Poland next. Susan?
All right, Jessica, please do stay with us. I want to have you weigh in on the next story from your colleague, Dora McQuarrie, as well. The U.S. presidential race between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump remains tight, but Harris has opened a sizable lead over Trump among one group of voters, women, who vote at higher rates than men. As VOA's Dora McQuarrie reports, Harris's late entry into the race widened the political party's gender gap.
Since 1984, more women than men have voted in U.S. presidential elections. And, for the most part, more of them vote for Democrats than vote for Republicans. Vice President Kamala Harris's sudden entry into the race, following President Joe Biden's July withdrawal, appears to have fired up this voting bloc.
We have seen a pretty significant shift across a lot of different demographics, but with women in particular, who are now much more likely to vote for the Democrat at the top of the ticket than they were when it was Biden.
This election year, roughly 1 in 5 women say abortion rights is their key issue. In 2022, Supreme Court justices nominated by then-President Donald Trump helped eliminate constitutional rights to an abortion. Trump wants each state to decide abortion laws. Harris wants federal legislation to protect reproductive freedom nationwide.
She's trying to create a world where people all have their rights to their own decisions, their bodies, their choices, women's rights.
She's for the people, which is the middle class, which I am middle class, and the laws about women's rights.
Among female voters, the latest poll suggests that Harris leads Trump by anywhere from 9 to 13 points.
She gained a lot of younger women independents, non-partisan voters under the age of 50, many of them under 40, who really got excited by her candidacy.
Black women are a lot more likely to vote for Harris now, Hispanic women. So, as we have seen her do better with a lot of these specific racial demographics or educational demographics, we have seen with women, that is really where that shift is coming from.
Male voters favor Trump by anywhere from 5 to 9 points, depending on the poll.
First, her being the candidate this is like horrific to me because, first of all, she's not prepared to be president.
For months, we would barely ever see Joe Biden, and all of a sudden, Kamala Harris is the nominee for the Democratic Party when she was never nominated in the first place. She came out of nowhere.
The gender gap persists among young voters in Gen Z, where a majority of men under the age of 27 favor Trump, according to pollster David McLennan.
There has been an increase in terms of the admiration of some Gen Z young men for, swagger. It's very much a macho, punch him in the face kind of thing.
McLennan says young men are politically socialized by online sources, where they often see and hear unflattering opinions about female leaders.
So they believe that women can't make the tough decisions. If the United States were to go to war or face international crisis, they don't believe that women have the ability to make the tough call.
White women were key to Trump's victory in 2016. He also won a majority of white women in 2020. In this race, the latest polls show Harris and Trump statistically tied among white women. Dora McQuarrie, VOA News, Washington.
VOA's Jessica Stone is still joining us live from the White House. Jessica, we've seen competing visions of masculinity and femininity on display during the campaign since Harris entered the race. How's that contributing to the widening gender gap in the voting public?
Well, the Harris campaign has really cast her husband, second gentleman Doug Emhoff, as a supporting character, as someone who is very supportive of his wife being at the top of the ticket and who has been going to great lengths, particularly at the recent convention, to talk about her personal side and to help people get to know her through his eyes. Meantime, Vice Presidential pick Tim Walz is also in a supporting role. Again, two men in supporting roles for a woman at the top of the ticket. Walz is also the picture, really, of what we might describe as traditional masculinity. You know, he was a former soldier, he was a football coach, he's a teacher, a hunter, but he's also someone who has taken a strong position for reproductive rights for women. And Democrats call this tonic masculinity as opposed to toxic masculinity, which might be more accurately described as traditional male roles that can sometimes lead to the devaluing of women. We do see Trump doubling down on this idea that he's a warrior. Even his vice presidential pick, J.D. Vance, talking about how he's too tough for all the tyrants of the world. The campaign really courting male voters, as you heard in that story there, but also through online forums promoting that traditional view of masculinity. Harris, though, took him to task on that during the recent debate, saying that these strong men and the idea of strong men were trying to manipulate President Trump, and essentially that they were trying to laugh at him. Susan?
Very interesting. One voting bloc that is being watched closely is the African-American bloc, notably African-American men. Why is that important?
Well, this is a voting bloc that both campaigns actually think is more up for grabs, particularly black men under the age of 40. In 2020, Donald Trump gained 12% of the black male vote, and he was up to 20% just ahead of Harris coming into the race. Now black men are particularly focused on what the economy can do for them. Overall, as we've said before, Trump is polling higher on that issue. They also tend to be skeptical of the whole election process, and of course his narratives about problems with the elections and election voter fraud, they play to that theme as well. But the Harris campaign has really made a special effort to reach out to these voters, raising $1.3 million from them just after she got into the race. An Ipsos poll this week finding that 4 out of 5 black registered voters say they will probably or definitely vote for the Harris-Walz ticket. So something to keep an eye on for us as we look at exit polls coming out of the November election.
Yeah, of course, we'll be following that very closely. Jessica, thank you so much for joining us and have a great weekend.
You too.
For all the latest news, download the WION app and subscribe to our YouTube channel.